Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ria, and I will be recording today's session. Today, we've been conducting these lectures since August of last year, and we've gotten a really good, diverse response from participants, not just from India, but multiple other countries. And that makes us a lot more interested in pursuing these workshops and these lectures again. Last month, we also started conducting NIRMAN workshops. So these are practice-friendly sessions on different topics that will be useful for practitioners, parents, teachers. Our this month's lecture is going to be on. They're not lectures; they're workshops, and these workshops are going to be on preschool education. So do keep a lookout in your inbox for the same. We'll be announcing the details by next week. And thank you for joining this month's lecture series, The Politics of Childhood. There are two lectures in this series. The first one is today's session, which is Childhood Education and Dalits, and tomorrow's session is going to be on Childhood Education and Gender. Uh, Welcome to today's lecture. The topic, Childhood Education and Dalits. In this topic, Professor Nita Kumar will talk about how there are different interlinkages between the Dalit identity and the experiences of childhood, and how there is a strong need of differentiated educational system and pedagogies in order to work with such disadvantaged communities. Before we start the session, I would like to give a few introductions about NIRMAN, about today's lecture, about today's speaker. So NIRMAN is a not-for-profit organization. It's based out of Varanasi district and city. We work in the city as well as uh, 12 adjoining villages. NIRMAN started in 1990, and this is our 30th year of working in the fields of education, arts, music, research. We run an innovative school called Vidyashram, the South Point School. We have two campuses, one in the Betawar village and one in the city. It's an integrated school, so students of different backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, all study together. So that means that we have students from families of weavers, farmers, daily wage workers, entrepreneurs, researchers, teachers, professors. They're all part of this. They're all working, studying together. We also run a research wing called the Center of Post-Colonial Education. We host study abroad students from various universities around the world, and we invite collaborations in education, research, music, lots of arts projects as well that are conducted under our artists studio. And now I would like to introduce a little bit about Nita ma'am. She's known to us as Nita ma'am here at NIRMAN. She's also known to a lot of people as Professor Kumar. She completed her PhD from the University of Chicago. Her fields of research have been in history of modern India, anthropology, as well as Russian and European history. She takes a lot of courses in South Asian history, gender, Bollywood. She's taught at University of Chicago, Brown University, University of Michigan, amongst other places. She's written multiple books, research papers. In the email that I'll send next, I will share her blog with you. You can have a look at what she's written, formally and informally. And mainly, of course, she is the director and founder of NIRMAN. So for the past 30 years, she's taught, written curricula, trained teachers, worked with children, worked on children's books and various arts projects at NIRMAN. She's also conducted training sessions for teachers outside of NIRMAN. So we have a lot of students from colleges like Miranda House, Lady Shriram College in India, and international colleges like Lewis and Clark, University of Washington, Columbia University, who visit us for these training sessions. And yeah, now before I take up more of your time, I would like to invite Nita ma'am to start today's session.
Thank you, Ria, and thank you to everyone from my side for joining in. I'm so glad that you're interested in the topic, and I hope we will make some headway in unpacking it, as they say, deconstructing it, and comprehending it a little bit more. I know that all of you must be different kinds of people. There must be some who are more interested in maybe the history and sociology of it, the politics of it, and maybe even more inclined to theory, or just a conceptual grasp. And there may be some who are much more of a practitioner, and they actually teach in the classroom, and they maybe have a lot of students of the Dalit community, and they are interested in how their pedagogy and interaction with these students could be better understood by them. So I'm going to proceed as if I realize that there are these 2 or 3 kinds of people in my audience. That is the more academic on one side and the more practice-oriented on the other side. Because curiously enough, I'm also both things. So Ria mentioned that I'm a professor and have taught in various places, and one of my research topics has been children and education, including of Dalits. And at the same time, she also mentioned that we have this organization, NIRMAN, that works on many aspects in research and applied work. But also we have a school, Vidyashram, the South Point, and it's a very integrated school. So there are children from Dalit families, there are staff members at NIRMAN of Dalit families. We have had teachers also, and we are, and I personally am very, very engaged at several levels, from research to conceptualization to actual practice with Dalits. Okay, so with that, welcome you again, and look forward to interacting with you at the end of my lecture, hopefully of 35 to 40 minutes. So we'll continue from there. I was going to begin by telling you about 2 kinds of people who I freshly met literally yesterday and today in order to be warm and ready for this talk. So we have a campus in the village, and the village is Betawar of Varanasi district. And we have Dalit children in our school, so I know the Dalit community in that village. And after many months of lockdown and so on, I went for a walk in that basti. It's called the Harijan Basti. And I was immediately accosted by a lot of people, greeted by many, and someone warmly invited me home. So I went inside, never to refuse an invitation, and had a nice conversation with them. And the 4 or 5 things that we covered are important points for us in today's talk. So I'm just going to tell you what happened in that conversation. This family has 5 or 6 little children. They are very interested in education. So they looked around to see what school to put their little children in, literally from 3 years. So they are truly interested. My first question was, why not the government school in the village? And they did agree that it had had a facelift. It was looking good. It was freshly painted. There were new toilets and drinking water facilities. There was trees, and it looked fine. There was even access for wheelchairs. But they shook their heads and said, it's not going to work for us because the teachers are just the same. And they did not elaborate on that, but they said the teachers are as they used to be. There's no difference in that. So they don't trust the state schools. But what they do trust is our private schools. Now, private schools are beyond their means. They made that very clear. We can't afford to go to any of the 12 or so private schools in the 3 or 4 surrounding villages. So what do? They look for a private school of another kind, which is the NGO school. And the church, the Christian church in this area, both in the city and now I discovered in the villages, does have a presence. It has campuses and schools at intervals. So they found one quite close to them and admitted all the children there. I was surprised. I said, how did you even know about it? They said that the people from that school had wandered around the village scouting and had met people, the families like theirs, and invited them to come and join and admit their children there, which they did, and they were very satisfied. They thought it was a fine school, etc. Now, there are 3 points here already. One is that Dalit families are very interested in education, going by this family. The second is that they do not trust government schools, but they want a private school. The third is that of private schools, they can't afford the ones that you and I can, so they look for an NGO school. which could be of any denomination. That's completely irrelevant to them. And the fourth is that they and others, along with others, are of the mentality which I have elsewhere in my writings described as modern, quote unquote modern. That is, they want their children, they want what they want for their children are the following. They want discipline, including in their uniform, the timing, the demand for punctuality, certain kind of behavior, replying in fragmented English, and of course the academic routine of homework and classwork, exams and tests and so on. So this for them is a modern school, and this is what they like, and the children must experience this, and they must be able to observe that this is what is happening. Finally, since there was no teaching happening during the lockdown, their children had been at home for several months, at which this family, being as interested in education as it was, sent them to an educated young man in the neighborhood for tuition. So little children, just barely 4, 5, 6, and so on, were being tutored. And elsewhere, we know from other sources and so on, not just now, that this kind of tutoring consists of more drill work, more regurgitation, more repetition, and rote learning. So this is one family. And I want to tell you about another Dalit person. I'm going to call her Durga for short. She's a staff member in our organization and has been with us for at least 20 years. She describes herself as a Harijan. I'll come to the difference between that and Dalit in a second. And at other times, she has called herself Anusuchit Jati or scheduled caste. I asked about her family. Her father-in-law, being of the Chamar Jati, had the job of looking after the footwear outside one of the premier Banaras temples. So a big job, because the temple is a very busy one. Lots of people visit all the time. They leave their shoes outside, and these people had the theka, that is the monopoly in a way, of looking after those shoes, and the earnings were several hundreds of rupees a day. This is way back then. So after the father-in-law's death, the 3 sons, of whom one is her husband, got the same thing and had to divide it up. So every 3rd week they could do that. It was their turn to do the work for a week. The 3 sons, of whom 2 have expired, there's only one alive, have 2 to 3 sons each. And they're all still doing the work. So now they get a turn every 7th, 8th, 9th week. I believe 1 or 2 have left the profession, but all the others are there. So while covering all this ground, I had to ask her, what about education? Why are some children in your family not getting a liberal education and then moving on to some other kinds of jobs? When I said some other kinds of jobs, the only thing she could think of was starting a little shop or learning a trade, which many people, who are semi-educated in Banaras try to do, mostly a mason's trade or an electrical, workman's trade. She said that it just had not happened because none of them had the drive. So, it's a personality issue also. But about the schooling question of mine, she just shook her head and said, it hadn't worked out. Yes, the children at present were going to schools, but again, they were going to an NGO school. And it was not at all a certain thing that they were going to complete their education. She was quite certain that there was no other profession in their life apart from what they were doing. She also mentioned that this caste that she was, the Chamar caste that she was from, was one of the higher ones. Because when I asked again, you call yourself a Harijan, why don't you call yourself a Dalit? And she said, Dalits are lower. They may be other castes, but we are not them. And there is a sweeper in our organization. She mentioned him by name and said he is of that caste, but she wouldn't specify. So I had to ask precisely. I said, is he a bhangi, which is the way sweepers are usually described? And she said yes, and screwed up her mouth, but she did not say that word. Now, what I want to take away from this exchange is that, firstly, I just said that Dalit families are interested in education. But now I'm saying that there could be many Dalit families who are actually not interested in education. And that's a very important question, why they are not. In this person's case, they are not because there is a combination of ignorance as to what and how to go about the education. There is a distrust in the state schools. She didn't at all mention the local primary school as being an option. And at the same time, there is a kind of understanding that even after that, there may not be any prospect to easily enter. This job that they have had of looking after the footwear outside a temple is such a certain thing. It is so real and has been in the past for many decades so rewarding. They can see in society around them that there is no one who's just getting an education and then automatically getting a job. The place is full of people who have finished high school and then even some other degree like a BA or whatever, at least intermediate, and they're all struggling to work. There is nothing that associates schooling with jobs. So a combination of all those things probably explains her families and many families like hers lack of interest in education. But I want to make the point that they're both kinds of families. And I literally picked them out of a hat. There are many children whose houses I could have visited, and there are many staff members. I just said, okay, let me talk to him, let me talk to her. And these were the results I got, two completely different kinds of Dalit families. Okay, so let me connect all this with a broader discussion. And let me begin by doing what I usually do. I want to first give you the context of Dalits education and childhood. I'm just wondering if maybe Ria, you can tell me, there was a question and I feel there's someone else's question, whether I can speak in Hindi also. Is that, am I correct in understanding that?
One person did, but we have a lot of international lecture attendees also today.
Okay, all right. So next time, not this time, right? Okay, good. All right, so let me quickly mention a couple of very important sociological and historical facts about the thing called caste, right? Okay, so sociologically, there are two important ways to look at caste, two important views on caste and therefore on the phenomenon called untouchability, which is a word used in the literature, so it's not a problem.
I'm sorry, but I'm thinking that if you would like to speak in Hindi, that's okay, as long as we're translating it.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try. It's also a question of time, so maybe I'll make a few points and then I'll summarize it together in Hindi. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So primarily in English, and then I'll try to summarize it in Hindi. Okay, so these two approaches to caste are the following. One is that it is a structure, which is a hierarchical structure. So it's a structure of domination. And that means that there is always someone above you in the social ladder, as well as someone below you, of course. And it's all about this hierarchy. And everyone knows precisely where they are placed. Now, as we know, hopefully, this structure has weakened ever since independence. It has been gradually weakening. So that, especially in urban areas, less so in villages maybe, but especially in urban areas, it's possible to not be part of that structure and not be part of that hierarchy. What has taken its place is what's called, a more of a turning inside by each caste. So they become more like ethnic groups with characteristics that they feel are peculiar to them. So in a benign kind of way, it can be looked at as family socialization or as some kind of hereditary specialization, etc., which includes lifestyle and often profession as well. Now, this may be the case, but there is an inherent hierarchy in that as well. Because even if you keep it within your family, you talk only within your family about who you are and how you do things, you are rather, I think, not so implicitly, rather explicitly comparing yourself to others in some kind of a hierarchical ladder in your mind. So that's one approach. The other approach is of caste as an ideology, sometimes even as a discourse. That means it is similar to every other kind of hierarchy in the world, and everything is hierarchical sometime at from some approach or the other at some point or the other. Yeah. So caste is like that. That means that everyone has this kind of inside maybe grammar of the mind, if you like, in which they think that it's normal to be hierarchical. It's normal for people to be above or below others. And according to this understanding of caste, Dalits are fine. Untouchables are fine with their positioning because it seems natural to them, right? And whenever anyone looks down, there are many others below you in the social ladder. Whoever you are, there's someone else below you. I'm telling you, I want to emphasize this is only in the mind. It's not that it's a reality of any sort. It may also be a reality, it may echo a reality, but the point in this approach is to see it as an ideology. So you have the structure on one side, which is a social structure, a political structure, which can be taken advantage of by many political parties at election times and all that. And the other is an ideology. And that these two approaches yield very different interpretations of how Dalits function, how they choose, how they respond, what they can do, what they should do, and how non-Dalits, that is Savarna people, could relate to them, given this different kind of understanding. It's important to know that there are, in both cases, several ways of quote unquote escaping your caste, of changing it or just going outside it, negating it in some way or the other. Historically, there's a lot of documentation about how small people became big people, of how very low ranked people rose right up to the top to be kings, ministers, leaders, rulers, conquerors, etc. And more silently, how people moved from one part of the country to another, changed their identities, changed their names, changed their work, claimed different histories for themselves. So if you were to think at a big level, all over the subcontinent, all through the millennia and centuries at least, there has been a lot of movement to and fro, partly in search of a better life, but that has mostly included also raising yourself in the social status and giving yourself a slightly higher place in the ladder. This is not true only of Dalits, it's true of almost every single caste, including many castes within the Brahman Varna, right? And one of the most interesting things that historians and sociologists do is to show how they may look across a whole spectrum of communities and groups, but how each one of these gives their history as usually, typically, a history of some kind of a change, movement, indeed of downfall. They were higher before. Something happened, some transgression, some very humane attempt to help someone lower down, which involved a touch, which involved an exchange or a transaction. And after that, they were ranked lower, and now they have become aware and conscious, and they are back in that same status as they originally were. So this kind of story of whatever you call it, fall from grace, fall from heaven, yeah, original sin or whatever. There was a before, which was Eden, then there was this downfall, and now in the present times, there is again a resurrection of an old status. So this has been a very constant kind of theme to do with caste. So you could change yourself like that. I've come across some interesting work on the diaspora, in which people who have migrated to America have written about their experience, uh, personal narratives of untouchability, of still being racially discriminated against. And they're very interesting speculations as to whether you can therefore escape. Now, in the picture I just painted, apparently you can escape within India because everyone looks the same, right? And if you live long enough, incognito somewhere, claiming a different name, background, history, and so on, it's very unlikely that you will be quote unquote discovered or uncovered, right? You could pass and you could, get away with it. That's historically what has happened. And even if you were to be quote unquote discovered, but a couple of generations later, it actually ceases to matter because it just becomes another narrative or story in the past. So one doesn't know. And I want to emphasize that, again, you could look at it in two ways. You could say there's no point in looking at this as a benign development. Why did they have the need to escape? Why did they have the need to go anywhere else or to change their status, to change their identity, right? The real problem is in this hierarchy and this discrimination and the caste system itself. You'd be right if you said that. But the point is that there's no point in just going on, worrying about what exists. We have to actually try to interpret or analyze it. And given that the caste system existed and exists in fact, we have to understand how people did negotiate their way around it, what they did to overcome this discrimination and inequality. So one of the things they did was to move physically and in terms of their identity and their history. We have to bring up the name of Bhimrao Ambedkar right now, because he was the one who is an exemplar of the second way of escaping your identity, which is through education, right? So, and he was not the first. Now, he's a 20th century man. But I want to mention that, again, historical research shows that there have always been many, many, many different kinds of efforts to, quote unquote, educate yourself out of that status where certain kinds of things were denied to you, including in education. And these are not just nice folk tales or mythology. We may not have a lot of writing on it yet, but what scholars point out is that that itself is not an indication for something to be missing. The missing research does not prove that the phenomenon itself is missing. And there are many, many reasons for missing research. One of them, I'm now coming to another topic, which is called the colonial construction idea. One of them is that during the colonial period, which is a good 2 centuries almost, there was an effort by the colonial state and its institutions to put much more weight on higher castes in every way, in terms of the facilities that were offered to them, in terms of the recognition given to them, in terms of using them as the spokesmen, the spokespeople for the whole of Indian society. So even though lower castes and Dalits might form up to 50% of the Indian population, they were never in the colonial period given anywhere near that kind of position. It was all about the upper castes, especially Brahmins, to some extent Kshatriyas, giving their version of what India was, what Indian society was, Indian languages, Indian culture, Indian history, etc. And this over the generations, because 2 centuries means something like 8 generations of people, this in turn became such a taken for granted state of affairs, and Indians themselves internalized it and imbibed it, that most of the time when we are talking, that means you and I, when any of us are talking, we are giving only one kind of perspective on India and Indian history and society. We are only giving the upper caste perspective, because that's the record that we have inherited from the colonial times, and that has become our record. That's become the history we study and talk about, the stories we relate, the narratives we know. These are all upper caste ones, and the lack an absence of knowing enough about lower caste ones does not mean that they didn't exist, that there were no voices. Those voices have been silenced, but they have been temporarily silenced. And it's not that they've been silenced totally. There's lots of work which has uncovered the voices of Dalits and lower caste people over the 19th century. And before that, of course, is the pre-colonial period on which a different kind of research exists. But in the colonial period itself, there's been instances of writing and creation, which has not otherwise become familiar to us. In most of our compendiums of, say, the history of Hindi literature, the history of Gujarati literature, etc., or any other part of the country, enough space has not been given to Dalit voices. So, sorry. So coming back to Bhimrao Ambedkar, he, as you know, was the constructor and the leading person in the making of the new India, in the sense of its constitution. And he is always used as a role model for anyone who believes in and wants to claim the importance of education for changing your status and for ridding yourself of a very burdensome social positioning. Because Ambedkar did it in his own life. He did it and he proved that it could be done. But he was also an angry person who was a leader who did not make compromises. Now, in the Constitution, together with the Constitution, he seems to show and put before us the idea that something called liberal democracy could be the hope for India and all its citizens. That means that it would not just be a situation where India has thrown off the trammels of a foreign government, namely Britain, but it is within itself also going to now opt for a much more egalitarian society. So this is what Ambedkar seems to stand for. This is the constitution that he led in its formulation. At the same time, he did not seem to actually have much hope that India would be able to do away with discrimination. And he did again and again ask whether other leaders, you know, Gandhi is a very important example of someone he came to lock horns with, were going to ever be the right leaders for India, because they fudged, as he saw it, this whole business about inequality and discrimination. Let's say that what he seems to have believed was that certain democratic spaces would be created, not that the results were visible and realizable in the near immediate future, and not that the results would ever arrive ready-made. They would all have to be struggled for, but at least there was the potential of them by creating, through a constitution, a certain kind of setup for liberal democracy. Let's talk about liberal democracy for a minute. Let's talk about contemporary India then. So I just told you about colonialism, and that is called, at least by historians and others who reflect on history, as the colonial construction model, by which we mean that many things that we take for granted as natural about India have actually come into being in their present state because of the way the colonial state constructed them, right? So construction means that they actually manipulated the reality, not that there were not many aspects of the reality that already existed, but the final result which we have today is largely a product of colonial maneuvering. So that is one thing, but the nationalist movement in India was very clear that they wanted to have a future of a liberal democracy in India. And this was something that has been, again, interpreted as being divided in two ways, according to caste again. So upper caste people understood this ideal of a liberal democracy to mean mostly independence from Britain. And lower caste and Dalits saw it as also implying some kind of an egalitarian society. This is a model which I'll mention again tomorrow when we talk about girls, women, and gender, because it's very similar to the kind of experience that women had. Women also during the nationalist movement tried to fight both for women's equality as well as for national freedom. Dalits also wanted much more social equality as well as national freedom. But upper caste people and men in both cases saw it only through the prism of one thing. They had already the privileges within their own ranking in society to not have to worry about them. And they were only worried about the problem of equality at a universal level. They were not equal to the British. The men were not equal. They did not have the same status or privileges or rights or opportunities. And so this whole struggle for India's independence and the struggle to build up a liberal democracy was already based on a splintered kind of approach in the people of India, right? The upper caste people, I say upper caste meaning the three upper castes, right? The Vaishyas, three Varnas, Vaishyas, Kshatriyas, and Brahmins, or also called Savarna, and lower caste meaning Shudras, and then the fifth, so-called fifth Varna, meaning the Dalits. So the two approaches of the Savarnas and the lower caste and Dalits. Now, in present-day India, we have market liberalization from the 1990s. We have a new and aspiring middle class or middle classes, and lots of avenues of social mobility. But three are really important: new occupations, the reduction of the village as an important locus, that is greater urbanization. And then we have the affirmative action program of the Mandal Commission. So this Mandalization, as it's called, of Indian politics, which has been happening progressively from 1990, has led in two different directions. On the one hand, yes, of course, it has opened up and made people aware of all the opportunities that could exist and do exist within all these reserved seats in various institutions. But at the same time, it has increased the consciousness of caste, including of a new group that didn't exist before, of other backward castes. And then with all these new labels and new constituencies, we have new regional parties, we have new alliances between parties, we have new kinds of politicking and electioneering. Now, this is a little bit outside our scope, but I wanted to muddy the waters further by making it clear that we're not talking about some kind of clear-cut group called Dalits, whom we'll then approach in a simple way. One of the biggest mistakes we could make is to think of Dalits simplistically as one unit that can be talked about across the board. And I've brought this in 2 or 3 ways. One, by talking right in the beginning with my anecdotes about how education is valued or not valued, what difference it can make in the lives of people. And then talking about the ranking and division between Dalits. And now talking about how the politics and the political ideologies, which has now characterized our public life from the 1990s, has had diverse effects on them. Let me leave this historical scenario by saying just one or two things. I think that in terms of the size and dimension of it, we do have the world's probably biggest affirmative action program with the biggest and most complex kinds of results. We do have reservations in educational opportunities. We do have reservation in jobs. And all this is being taken advantage of by people when and if they can. So the potential is there for its use. There is a lot of harassment associated with it. There's a lot of discrimination that goes on. And there's a lot of mistakes that are made and a lot of ignorance that exists. but by and large, the program has been put in place and has lasted for many, many years. However, now we come to the real problems. Okay, can you just give me a little break from the English speech? And I'm just going to take about 5 quick minutes to summarize a few things in Hindi. हम 2-3 चीजें अभी तक बता रहे थे. सबसे पहले तो ये कि जो दलित शब्द है, जिसको कभी-कभी लोग हरिजन कहते हैं या अनुसूचित जाति कहते हैं, और उसके असलियत में अलग-अलग जाति के नाम हैं, जैसे कि चमार, भंगी इत्यादि. तो ये जो शब्द है, इसका मतलब ये नहीं है कि कोई एक बना हुआ ग्रुप है, कोई ऐसे सचमुच के लोग हैं जिनको आप कह सकें कि ये सब एक हैं. उनके बीच में बहुत सारे विभाजन हैं, बहुत सारे उनके बीच में भी रैंकिंग है. और एक तो हमने अभी बताया कि अगर कोई अपने को एक नाम से बुलाता है, भंगी, चमार इत्यादि, जाटव वगैरह, महार, तो वो अपने को किसी एक लेवल का सोचते हैं जिसके नीचे और लोग हैं. तो एक तो तरीका है जाति के बारे में सोचने का ये कि ये दिमाग में एक तरह की सोच है, एक ये फिलॉसफी है, विचारधारा है, जिसमें आप हमेशा किसी के ऊपर हैं और किसी के नीचे हैं. मतलब ये बिल्कुल कुदरती चीज है. और अगर ये पर्सपेक्टिव लिया जाए जाति प्रथा के ऊपर, तब ये समझ में आता है कि दलित भी खुश हैं, क्योंकि उनको मालूम है कि हम इस रैंक पे हैं और हमारे नीचे भी बहुत से लोग हैं. अब इसमें तो बहुत सी समस्याएं हैं, ये तो प्रॉब्लम्स हैं, क्योंकि हम लोग कैसे ये मान लें कि दलित लोग खुश हैं जब वो देख रहे हैं कि उनको एक बहुत नीचे स्थान पे रखा गया है. लेकिन ये एक विचारधारा है जाति को समझने के लिए. और दूसरी ये है कि हमेशा आप चाहे अपने को कहें भी कि मैं जाति प्रथा में विश्वास नहीं करता हूँ, मैं ये सब बात नहीं मानता हूँ, लेकिन आजकल क्या होता है, होता यह है कि उसको अपने परिवार के अंदर रख लिया जाता है, अपने खानदान के अंदर, और हर खानदान, हर परिवार सोचता है ये तो मेरे तौर तरीके हैं, अपने बच्चों को बड़ा करने के ये हमारी प्रथाएं हैं, और ये भी सोचता है कि ये सब मुझको किसी और से ऊंचा साबित करती हैं. सब लोग को अपनी चीज पसंद है और अपनी चीज को बड़ा मानते हैं. ठीक है. और इस विचारधारा या इस एनालिटिकल तरीके के अनुसार जो नीचे हैं इस लैडर में, सीढ़ी में, जो कि दलित हैं, जिनके बारे में आज बात कर रहे हैं, वो खुश नहीं है, खुश हो ही नहीं सकते, क्योंकि वो यही सोचते हैं कि मुझको क्यों इस जगह में पहले से मेरी परिभाषा बनी हुई है, मैं किस तरह से यहाँ से निकलूं. और निकलने के कुछ तरीके हैं, कुछ ऐतिहासिक तरीके हैं. लोग अपने जगह छोड़ के कहीं चले जाते थे, अपना नाम बदलते थे, काम बदलते थे, अपने रहने के, रहन सहन के तरीके बदलते थे, मीट खाना छोड़ दिया या कुछ भी, औरतों को पर्दे में रख लिया. तो इस तरह ये तो एक बहुत पुराना तरीका है. और एक और जो तरीका था वो था शिक्षा का, एजुकेशन का, जिसमें हम लोग सबसे पहले तो भीमराव अंबेडकर जी, बाबा साहेब अंबेडकर का नाम याद करते हैं, क्योंकि उन्होंने अपने जीवन में अपने एग्जाम्पल से दिखाया करके कि कैसे एक छोटी जात का व्यक्ति पढ़ लिख के पूरे अपने देश के संविधान का लीडर बन सकता है, नेता बन सकता है. तो लेकिन ये उनसे पहले था, ये शुरू से ही रहा है एक तरीका अपने स्थान को छोड़कर आगे बढ़ने का, मोबिलिटी का, सोशल मोबिलिटी का शिक्षा रहा है. और अंबेडकर ने जब संविधान लिखा, जो उनका हाथ था उसमें, तो उनके अनुसार ये नहीं है गारंटीड कि जो संविधान में डेमोक्रेसी, प्रजातंत्र वगैरह जिस चीज का संदेश है वो ऑलरेडी हमको प्राप्त हो चुकी है या वो ऑलरेडी हमको हासिल हो चुकी है. ये सब नहीं है, उसके लिए हम लोगों को लड़ते रहना है. लेकिन एक जगह तैयार हो गई है, एक स्पेस तैयार हो गई है, जिसमें अगर चाहें तो हम उसका फायदा उठा सकते हैं. यहाँ तक हमने थोड़ा और डिटेल में इंग्लिश में बताया था. अब हम फिर से कंटिन्यू करते हैं. All right, so I want to come back to contemporary India. And by which I mean, really from 1950 onwards, from the time of the Constitution onwards. And what is staggering really is the lack of political will. We have been able to push forward the date in which there will be universal and equal education for all, again and again and again. And we have not been able to justify it. We have not been able to come up with solutions which are better than the previous ones. I just mentioned this business of repainting the government schools and providing toilets, drinking water facilities, and so on, planting trees, all very nice, very good. But they have not hit on the nail the actual problems of why people are still withdrawing their children from these schools, why they're losing children, and why no one, including Dalit families, has any reason to trust them. So my research, ethnographic research in some of these schools, revealed a very simple kind of scenario, very simple, so transparent as to be shocking in its transparency. Teachers and administrators, such as the principal, and anyone who is commenting on that. So it could be someone who's showing me around, and they would talk very glibly of the children of, in their school as coming from chote log, chote kaum, pichdi hui jati. They would not use the word Dalits, but they would definitely say chota, pichde hue, gire hue, and niche is often used. And this definition, pinpointing in the presence of the children, they would describe them as that, has a very preordained result. All the research on the subject, all the research, there's immense amounts of research, shows that if you already describe a child as being backward, then the chances are immense that the child will indeed function lower than capacity. And here we have a society-wide, nationwide phenomenon where children are already being described as doomed to fail, then they are being made to fail, and then they are being confirmed as failing. I run a private school, so I can, of course, control much of the behavior in the classrooms. And I have to spend a lot of time with teachers just pushing this point in that all children are equal and have to be treated equally. Ours is a school which has all kinds of children of different classes, working class people, very labor class and down and out, and, every single profession is covered. And I can tell that even if it's not in front of me, I can glimpse that teachers and all adults are inclined to be discriminating. They automatically think that a child who comes from a middle class family is going to perform better because he's more neatly dressed, he's a little better looking in some way to their gay middle class gaze. And a child who has obvious stigmatic kinds of evidence of poverty or some kind of neglect at home is going to perform worse academically. So this is a pedagogical problem. This is what I'm trying to say. It starts at the level of politics. The discrimination is in one's head. There is already some kind of an idea that people are better or worse, that people are inferior or superior, forward or backward. And this can be compared, if you like, as has been done by scholars, with race. Sometimes it's been compared productively to race, but also it's been pointed out that there are some very important differences, and both race and caste have to be studied separately for their own kinds of functioning. Yeah. But whatever it is, it's as stigmatizing as races. You could perhaps escape because it's not visible on your skin very often as races. But for the most part, people make it visible by characterizing you in certain ways. So this thing which starts as a political problem, then, according to me, assumes pedagogical dimensions. Because what happens in the classroom is that there is no will, and therefore there is no prospect, there is no progress in developing any strategies to teach children equally. So you already first state that children are not going to be able to learn, that these particular children are from a certain background, so they're not going to ever succeed in the classroom. And then you refuse or fail to use any of the strategies that could actually make your classroom a space where all kinds of children could successfully learn together. And in that pedagogical failure lies, again, a confirmation of the politics with which you had started. So there is a debate, which I have shared in many conferences and exchanges with other scholars, about whether actually all children could learn equally well. And according to the scholars on the opposite side to me, it's very important to know the caste and the background of the children and to treat them specifically with that in mind. So they would, I'm not sure what they would propose, maybe separate schools for Dalit children, just like you have, separate schools for girls, because girls don't perform as well when they are in a co-ed school as they do when they're simply in a girls' school, something like that maybe. But my own experience for 30 years with our school, my research on the subject, my own understanding of it, has led me to think that actually there are, of course, many differences among children and students, but caste is only one of them. There is a very important difference, which is class. There's an extremely important difference, which is gender. And between, within, and including all of them and overlapping all of them, there are myriads of other differences which should be taken into account and used productively in the pedagogical scenario of leading a classroom which is diverse. So this debate continues, and my own experience and the understanding I have of the power of pedagogical strategies makes me think that there is a way out. However, optimistic as I might be, I'm also profoundly pessimistic. The present day privatization of all kinds of facilities, we know about, water and gas and energy and so on, but including, medical facilities, and including, most of all, education, the progressive privatization of that. And then the development, therefore, of what's called a creamy layer in each community only deepens the divisions and hierarchies in our society. And all the time, what makes me truly pessimistic and worried to death is that the quality of education, knowledge, therefore the quality of life itself, is only worsening. So in the very first story which I told you about this village family, in which all the 4 or 5 children were going to this NGO school, which was now shut, so they were going to a tutor. I worry because I'm convinced already that they're not going to make it. They're not going to actually achieve the social mobility, which is their dream and aspiration. The kind of studies that they are doing, not only with the tutor, but in that quote unquote modern school, which was being described to me, is not going to lead them to fulfill their ambitions. The quality of the pedagogy in government schools, of course, but also in most small-scale private schools, is not the kind that would allow someone to escape their social status. I would love for you to ask some questions, if you have any, and I can just summarize meanwhile while you think of your questions in Hindi, the second part of what I said. वर्तमान इंडिया, भारत के बारे में बात करें तो ये हो रहा है आजकल कि क्योंकि हम लोगों के यहाँ अब मार्केट लिबरलाइजेशन हो गया है ना, फ्री मार्केट हो गया, फ्री मार्केट इकोनॉमी, जो चाहे आप खरीदें और जितना चाहे आप खरीदें और हर कुछ मंथली पेमेंट से हो जाता है। तो इसी के साथ साथ बहुत ज़्यादा एक डेवलपमेंट ये हुआ है कि सब लोगों के मन में ये आशा आकांक्षा जागृत हुई है कि हम भी आगे बढ़ सकते हैं। अब इसमें एक बात तो अच्छी है, क्योंकि मंडल कमीशन के बाद जब अदर बैकवर्ड क्लासेस को भी इसमें जोड़ दिया गया, तो अच्छी बात यह है कि बहुत बड़ा साइज है जो रिजर्वेशन का है, बहुत सारी सीट्स हैं, इतनी सारी हैं कि कभी कभी वो भर भी नहीं जाती हैं, मतलब भर ही नहीं पाते हैं लोग। और इसी तरह से जॉब्स में भी है। तो अगर कोई सच में बहुत कोशिश करना चाहे, मेहनत करना चाहे, तो कहीं ना कहीं उनको स्थान मिल सकता है। लेकिन साथ साथ ये भी हुआ है कि ये नए मार्केट इकोनॉमी में जाति की सोच, जाति के बारे में सोच, उसकी कॉन्शियसनेस अभी बढ़ गई है, और ये बढ़ने से अलग अलग प्रॉब्लम्स आ गई हैं, जिसके अंदर हम लोग अभी नहीं जाएंगे। हम ये बात कहना चाहते हैं कि जब से हम लोग को स्वतंत्रता मिली है, बहुत बार हम लोग के जो भी हम लोगों ने डेडलाइन रखी है कि इस तारीख तक, इस साल तक हम लोग के देश में इक्वल और सबके लिए बराबर से शिक्षा मिलेगी, वो डेडलाइन को हम लोगों ने मिस किया है और उसको आगे बढ़ाते गए हैं। और आज के दिन भी अगर आप स्कूल में जाके देखें, जो सरकारी स्कूल हैं, तो वहां पे एक चीज बहुत ऑब्वियस है, आपको फौरन सुनने को मिलेगी। आप पूछेंगे कुछ बच्चों के बारे में, क्या ये बच्चों की पढ़ाई अच्छी तरह चल रही है, और आपको जवाब मिलेगा नहीं, क्योंकि ये नीचे वर्ग के हैं, ये पिछड़ी जातियों के हैं। आपको फौरन पिछड़ा, नीचा, छोटा, ये सब शब्द सुनने को मिलेंगे और उनके जाति के बारे में बताया जाएगा। अब ये अगर हम लोगों के एजुकेटर्स हैं जो इस तरह से बात कर रहे हैं, और एक जगह नहीं, हमने अलग अलग प्रदेश में ये बात सुनी है, अलग अलग प्रदेश में, राजस्थान, दिल्ली, वेस्ट बंगाल, उत्तराखंड वगैरह, यूपी के में तो है ही ये बात। तो ये जो सोच है, यही रिसर्च तो हम लोग को बताती है कि अगर आप बच्चों को पहले से ही छोटा, पिछड़ा हुआ या कमजोर बताएंगे, तो वो उसी तरह से फंक्शन भी करेंगे, उसी तरह से वो काम भी करेंगे। और इसमें हमारी सोच ये है, और हम लोगों का जो स्कूल है जो अब 30 साल पुराना है, उसमें हम लोगों का एक्सपीरियंस ये रहा है कि ये जो फेलियर है वो एक्चुअली एक टीचिंग फेलियर है, पेडागॉजिकल फेलियर है। इसका मतलब ये कि आपने अपने स्कूल में या अपने क्लास में ऐसे तरीके ही नहीं निकाले हैं कि आप इन बच्चों को पढ़ा सकें। जब आप नहीं पढ़ा पा रहे हैं, तब आप उनको स्टिग्मेटाइज कर रहे हैं, उनको बोल रहे हैं कि वो पिछड़े हुए हैं। पिछड़े हुए तो आप हैं एक शिक्षक के नाते, जो आप नहीं पढ़ा पा रहे हैं। तो हमने ये सब बताया, और इसके बाद हमने कहा कि आप लोग अपने सवाल दीजिए, अपने क्वेश्चंस बताइए, थोड़ा सा और डिस्कशन हो सकता है अगर कुछ हो तो आपके पास। Over to you, Ria.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. You would really like to see, I personally would, and someone else has also requested to see your reading list, recommended readings at the end. So, two questions. First one is by Shaima. She wanted to understand. They wanted to understand if how the silent voices in history or oral narratives of a community are accounted for, especially since they are not documented. So oral history is, I think, a point on that. And the next one, there are two more questions. Should I give them now? Or
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So the middle class are the largest consumers of education in India, and that is why a lot of when education is being designed, the pedagogy becomes a product for the middle classes. And so then how do we understand the alternative conceptions of ability and the potential among other social classes within the schooling context? So that is the next one. And the third one being that how do you define social mobility? Has this definition been created based on a phenomenological approach? Yeah, I think I'm just going to read that out. It's a comment for your work. It's great that you're doing an ethnographic study. So, would like you to comment on your construct of social mobility in intervention-based work or academia, and if it captures the aspirations of people who want social mobility. So these three, and then there are a few comments and maybe one question if we do have the time, or we'll cover them in the notes.
Yeah, let me just tackle these first.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Such interesting ones, especially about oral narratives in history. So I already mentioned that there seems to be a big silence from certain communities in history. And it's very easy to say. I know that sometimes political scientists do that, and they have been actually criticized by historians in turn. So historians feel amused when other kinds, people from other disciplines, say, oh, this does not exist or that does not exist. Actually, it exists. And historians are very aware that sometimes their tools are very weak, or sometimes their tools are over gross for such fine work. And history as a discipline has been, especially in recent times, in the last few decades, been trying to perfect more and more and refine its tools of doing research which could account for things which are not actually present in the archives, because the archives have traditionally been only written and collected and preserved stuff, but they have now been able to look at oral narratives as archives, as spatial, uh, things as archives, as at images, all kinds of artifacts and symbols, also as archives, and places where you never thought of, such as women's stories and songs and oral performances of different kinds. So, and it's not only historians, a lot of anthropologists do this and they delve into the past. So there is a potential for it. I mean, right now, the work has only begun, it's fledgling, but everywhere there are instances of it. So whatever is the region of India that you choose and the kind of thing that you want to look for, you'll find some work or the other already done within either history or anthropology typically, but sometimes history of religions or literary history also, on oral narratives. And of course, these narratives belong to women or Dalits or working class peasant people, tribals. These are typically all the lower down people in society whose words are not written down and not preserved in an archive. Um, about the question of middle classes having the largest space in society, and therefore, how do you, as I understand it, how do you overcome that middle class perspective when teaching or handling children, right? That's exactly right. All our curricula, all our procedures in school, everything we do and take for granted is extremely middle class in its structure and ideology and discourse. And it has to be a very, very conscious, deliberate, consistent effort to look for the other side also. So what is the other side? The other side is, as we just talked about, some oral things which are not present in the canons of tradition, right? They're not part of the epics, although everything can be read against the grain. So even if you have a canonical work, like, of course, one of the epics, Ramayana or Mahabharata, we all know that it's been read against the grain. There are many, many stories in each epic which have been turned upside down and stood on their head and looked at from the perspective of the person who seemed to be the small and unimportant functionary in that story. But when looked at from this new perspective, it turns out that he or she is the protagonist. So you can do that. Yeah, you can turn middle class values, to use contemporary terms, by just looking at who else is present in that scenario where you have a middle class protagonist. There are many other ways also. The most important way, perhaps, is just to overall develop a critical consciousness, which challenges and questions every single statement of fact, of seeming fact. So every time there is a seeming fact, you can also ask a question about it, like, how do we know? Whose voice is it telling us that? What is our source of information? And then be very objectively clear about what class means. If you can understand that and teach that, and actually, you can come to it in a number of ways. I was, of course, teaching something very relevant to it, in the sense that I was teaching the French Revolution recently. And it was a delight to be able to explain to the children that there were these three estates. And guess what? They're not very different to the kinds of quote unquote estates we might have now, and we might be struggling to get over. So the middle class is a new phenomenon. It can be historicized, it can be intellectualized, it can be explained, it can be deconstructed. When you do that, you yourself release yourself from some of those trappings, and whatever it is, whether it's a statement, a political thing, a media thing, a historical thing, a sociological thing, whatever it is, can be then seen in a different way to the normative, typical middle class way. I suppose an exception could be in the case of maths, right? I often worry about that because I'm not really up to date with my maths. I studied it back in school, and after that, not so much. And there's a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon that haunts me all the time, where Calvin, this little mischievous boy, is sitting there, and his math test has been returned to him with a big cross, because instead of 2 + 2 = 4, he wrote something else totally. And he is very upset, and he's telling the teacher, well, maybe in your universe that's true, but there are other ways to look at it. So we must draw a line, right? Things are middle class, but there are some things which we have to, even while we critically construct and deconstruct them, we have to worry about the core of knowledge that we are sharing with the students. And the last question, which was about definitions of social mobility, I'm not sure I have an answer for you, whoever asked that. So my phenomenological research or ethnographic research goes by what people say. And yes, that's very frustrating sometimes. I think that's what you're sort of getting at, because you could ask someone, what is it that you want for your children, right? So they might say, well, we are just educating them. Why are you educating them? What is it in their future that you want to see? What, in other words, what kind of social mobility are you hoping for? And routinely, across the board, they give the answer, oh, it's not in my hands. What am I going to plan or expect? It's up to them, right? It's their life. They are going to fashion it whichever way they like. And then you say, dang it all, that's not the answer I wanted. I want them to tell me what actually they think of in terms of social mobility. So, ethnographically speaking, or phenomenologically speaking, it's very difficult to understand what social mobility is, or what people actually want or expect. I think it's just a heuristic construct which we can use for the sake of understanding something, but that something is a little elusive.
All right, thanks. We have three more questions, but we are exceeding our time. So I think we could answer these questions in our notes. Yes? Okay. Thank you so much. There are three questions, and they're very interesting too. So we'll definitely put them in our notes. You should receive the notes and hopefully the recordings too in the next week. And yes, thank you so much for attending today. We have a talk tomorrow as well, same time 6 to 7, and the topic is childhood education and gender. So we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.